Thanks, Danny. So, hey, this is Suril. I'm VP of Engineering at Acalvio. We are a deception player, and I'm focused on subject matters related to cyber deception. So happy to connect with you today on the topic of mitigating the identity attack surface. Hopefully, it'll be an interesting discussion. So, so what I intend to cover today is the need for proactive reduction of the attack surface. So overall, I'm trying to lay out a strategy for mitigating the identity attack surface that exists in any Active Directory environment. So the first step would be a proactive step to reduce the attack surface. Then traditionally, enterprises have had monitoring for detecting AD threats. Then the role of Honeytokens for defending against identity threats, and then some recommendations on an effective strategy on how to get value from Honeytokens. So that's basically what I intend to cover. So from a proactive attack surface reduction perspective, the first step typically is that you perform a AD assessment to identify the attack surface. The team at Trimark are the experts in that space, and so typically most organizations should do something of that nature. And because that attack surface is what the attacker will exploit if they get into the environment, right? And so then once you have a set of findings, then the next step is to remediate the findings, right? Which is to reduce the attack surface, which is a essential prevention-based control effectively from a security perspective. The one challenge with remediation always is that it takes time because, so for example, if you take a large Active Directory environment and you run, any of AD assessment capabilities, you can find 1,000+ misconfigurations, and some of them are service accounts that are, administering important services, and so the business needs to be in the loop to make sure that there is no impact on, in any way. And so as a result, typically the remediation is a phased process and it can take time. Now, while you're going through the journey of remediating, and you can never really remediate it to zero because there will be always certain things where you will do a cost benefit analysis as an enterprise and try to figure out saying, should I uh, is it worth the risk of actually taking an impact on that system in order to do the remediation? So the idea is that it takes time and you cannot get it down to zero, which means the attacker can always exploit whatever residual attack surface is remaining, right? And so then the question is, what do you do next, right? Because there are misconfigured objects in the AD, they have not been remediated, or they will take a long time to remediate. They're going to remain, so the attacker will target them. So then a strategy to detect and more importantly diverting the attacker can be an important countermeasure, and we'll discuss that today. So traditionally, the organizations have taken a set of detection approaches which are based on Active Directory monitoring. These are useful, but they have several gaps, and I'll discuss some of them today. So one of the one of the challenges with that is that it can detect known bad. So if you know, for example, that the attacker, like for example, a known bad could be a password brute force attempt, right? So you know that that's something that should not be expected to be done, and so you can raise an alert accordingly. And so those type of things are not a challenge. But as Matt Graeber said, effectively a sufficiently advanced threat actor is indistinguishable from a competent system administrator, right? And so fundamentally the idea is that if the attacker has the credential and it is the right credential, and if you're trying to do log analytics or network traffic analytics and then try to find anomalies, it is hard to differentiate good from bad. And so as an example, on the right-hand side, if you see the alerts from Microsoft Defender for Identity, which is a popular platform for detecting identity threats, if you look at all the alerts, pretty much each alert has the keyword suspected as a prefix. And that effectively says that Microsoft themselves, who are the builders of Active Directory as well as the security product, are not sure whether that is actually malicious or not. And the reason for that is not a technical limitation, but it is a inherent in the nature of the approach used to detect, because you are effectively looking at real traffic and trying to figure out whether this is legitimate or malicious. And so that can have certain benefits, but it also has associated limitations. Let's look at a few of these gaps that our adversaries are exploiting. So for example, attackers can target credential caches on an endpoint. So Windows endpoint has about 40 plus credential caches. These include, caches in the operating system, caches in the applications. These can contain credentials for user accounts and service accounts. So the attacker can leverage readily available offensive tools. So for example, Lazan or Seatbelt, and of course the popular Mimikatz. These tools have an ability to extract credentials from the available caches, and whether it be a browser cache or a PuTTY cache, or in the OS case, a LSAS cache or a sysvol cache. So they extract these credentials, and once they extract the credentials, then they attempt lateral movement with these credentials. Now, if you look at the logs on the domain controller, or you look at the network traffic on the domain controller, it's very hard. If you have an offensive technique of this nature, it's very hard to know whether this is good or bad, because on that endpoint, there was some admin that did something in the first place that resulted in the cache being created. So at that time, a request had gone to the domain controller, which was a legitimate request. Now the attacker got to that endpoint and then did the same thing. And so now if you look at it from a perspective of a domain controller event or a network traffic at the domain controller, both of these look similar. So it's hard to be able to say whether this is a malicious action. And so many APT groups, whether it be APT3, 33, or Scattered Spider, are exploiting this gap in breaches. They're leveraging these type of offensive tools. They can write custom variants of these tools because many of these caches are well defined and standards based. So they take that and then they use it for performing offensive exploits. We'll take an example of a different gap, which is attackers are now targeting servers beyond Active Directory. So for example, the tier 0 ecosystem for the enterprise has many other servers in it, whether it be Active Directory Federation services, certificate services, Entra ID Connect, third-party sync agents. Many of these are there. And the attackers know that some of those, especially for example, if you take the case of a third-party sync agent, now that's a third-party component provided by some other vendor, and so it's installed by the enterprise. There would be very little monitoring on those. So the attacker knows that that's not going to be sufficiently monitored. But if they can go to that third-party agent, then they can get access to the credentials, because many of these agents are responsible for syncing the data from on-prem AD to the cloud. So as a result, they need to have a copy of the clear text credentials, at least in memory. And so what the attackers are doing, for example, in the MGM breach that occurred last year, they went after the third-party sync agent and then the ALF-V group, and then eventually got to the sync agent. And then there are well-known APIs like logon user W. You can hook these, and if you then watch for the authentication requests coming in, then you can get access to the credentials. Once you get access to these credentials, then you can log in into the domain. And again, it'll be very difficult to detect this as malicious because it exactly comes in with the right credential at the right time. So that's another example of a challenge. A third example is stealthy identity attacks. So for example, offline attacks like curb roasting that we just discussed in the previous session, where the attackers are performing, effectively taking the hash and cracking it, and everything offensive about it is performed offline. So effectively, it's very hard to detect that using, domain controller logs or network traffic. There are other attacks like client-side attacks, for example, silver ticket, which are effectively where you're impersonating the ticket, and again does not result in an easy way of detecting that as far as server-based monitoring is concerned. Yet another example is effectively novel variants. For example, there was an exploit last year called the dirty vanity attack, where the attacker is effectively able to evade the EDR and then dump credentials from LSAS on the endpoint and then use those credentials for lateral movement. And so these attacks are being used in active exploitation sequences. So for example, we all must have heard about the United Health ransomware exploit that occurred in February of 2024. And so the Alfie ransomware group, Black Cat, effectively generated a new variant called the Sphinx variant, which was used as part of that particular offensive sequence. And here is a quick analysis of the offensive life cycle of what Sphinx did, which is effectively they after getting initial access, the main objective was to get access to elevated credentials and permissions. And so they use Kerberoasting as part of their exploit sequence. And one of the reasons they did that was because they know that it is difficult to detect that type of an attack using traditional forms of detection. So if these are the gaps in traditional detection tooling, so what can the defenders eventually do? So you cannot really fully prevent the identity attack surface. You can reduce it to the extent possible. You can apply some traditional forms of detection, but those also have gaps. And so then there is a need for something more than that. So the first step is reduce the attack surface as a prevention control, because that's always a good thing and recommended thing. Then from a detection perspective, the idea is that no one layer can be comprehensive in itself. Each layer has its own prism and its own ability to detect a certain class of attacks, but the attackers have too many options. And so effectively, if you want to get comprehensive detection coverage, then the best approach is to combine detection layers. So you apply certain layers that are good at detecting known bad, and then other layers that are good at detecting evasive threats for which you may not have an a priori knowledge of the attacker TTPs. Then one other important aspect for defense teams to consider is that if you can change the landscape of the attacker and divert them away from the real accounts, then that is another effective mechanism, because ultimately the idea is that diversion is also an important technique in cybersecurity. If the detection is a good thing, but diversion can be even more effective, because if you can take the attacker away, then you're buying time for the defense. And when you're talking about runtime threat detection, then time is of the essence. And so that's where diversion plays a role. Now let's discuss what are honey tokens. And so honey tokens are effectively a class of deception techniques that involve planting deceptive forms of data into multiple places. The honey tokens concept itself is a fairly broad concept, has been there in academia and research and in the industry for a long time. But from honey tokens perspective, there's a class of honey tokens called identity honey tokens, which can be used for this use case, which are effectively honey token accounts. You can create accounts in the Active Directory, and these accounts could be privileged service accounts or user accounts. You have to make them enticing for the adversary to exploit. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then there are correspondingly honey tokens that are added on the endpoints, which are the deceptive credential profiles deployed in the OS caches and the application caches. These are derived from the honey token accounts which are added to the Active Directory. So you have a two-part combination of placing deceptions. Now the role of honey tokens. So effectively, the idea is that what honey tokens can do is to enable the defense to set a trap for the adversary. The traps are based on the goals of the adversary. They can represent privileged accounts, whether it be user accounts or service accounts. These are not used for existing workflows. So you're creating a new account that is not used for any other legitimate purpose, which means effectively any usage of that is an immediate indicator of a malicious action because the attacker does not have perfect information. That's the key idea. The attacker needs to do some amount of reconnaissance or enumeration. And if you set the trap correctly, then you should be able to detect because anybody who touches the trap is effectively the adversary. The actual admins know what the real accounts are. They're not going to look around in the environment to try to find whether there's an interesting account or not. So effectively, legitimate usage is not expected, and any usage is effectively an indication of a malicious activity. Now, because of the nature of this defense approach, the detection engineering is quite interesting because you're detecting agnostic to the attacker TTPs. So you're not actually worrying about whether it is a curb roasting attack or whether it's an ASREP roasting or a silver ticket. Instead, you're saying, what is the goal of the attacker, right? So the goal is to say, okay, I want to escalate privileges. I want to get to a domain admin. So you set a trap of that nature and the attacker will go after it and you will be able to detect, and it may not matter what the exact TTP was. The one other important role of Honeytokens is they can, because these are deceptive elements, but the attacker doesn't know that they're deceptive. So which means the attacker will go after them and waste their time. So you can divert and deflect the attacker away from the real identities and towards the deceptions. Now, this topic has been well understood in academia and research, but the challenge has been traditionally that if you want to roll this out, beyond typically many teams try to create one or try to create two accounts, but when you try to do this at scale, it becomes a little challenging because it requires a lot of domain knowledge of both of deception tech as well as the threat vectors. So, for example, administrators have to make decisions like, should I create one account or should I create a 10 or should I create 1,000, right? And what is the criteria to make a decision of this nature? That's a question in the administrator's mind. Then there are other more deeper questions like what values should we set? One object in Active Directory has about 100 plus attributes. And so the administrator has to make 100 decisions to create just one deceptive account in Active Directory. Some of these attributes are fairly involved, as we would know. For example, user account control is a bit mask. So now the administrator has to determine, should I enable bit 3 or should I disable bit 3? And every such decision has a consequence from a detection perspective. So it's hard to do this thing manually. Uh, so now the other question that the administrator needs to worry about is what should they represent? Should it represent a human account, a service account, both of them? Where should they be placed? In which OUs, for example? Should they be granted privileges or not? So effectively, the defense teams need a strategy to be able to get a concept like that operationalized. So here are some recommendations on a strategy. So for example, the overall idea is to apply a attacker's mindset for an effective strategy. And so you think from a perspective of an attacker as a defender, and then the strategy can be formulated and made effective. In deception tech, the traditional theory has been around density, which is to say, if you create many of fake objects, then you should be able to improve the chances of detection. However, this is not actually a practical proposition. So for example, let's consider an Active Directory domain that has 10,000 real accounts. Are we going to create 10,000 fake accounts, right? That's not really practical. So let's say, for example, you can create 50 fake. Now the attacker has 10,000 real accounts to target, and there are 50 fake. So how do you influence the attacker to go after the fake instead of the real? So now the goals of the attacker is the ones that should be used as the basis for the defense strategy. Ultimately, the attacker is after privileges and after something of value. So the main recommendation is that making these deceptions attractive to the attacker is essential. So it's not about putting many of them, but actually putting a curated set. Whatever each account that is there needs to be set in a made enticing for the adversary to exploit to be able to improve your chances of detection. So the key insight here is that effective density of deception is more important than actual density. So it's not about how many accounts are there. It is what are you doing to each of them to improve the chances of a detection. So here are some examples of a deception strategy. So for example, one approach is to create a honey tokens with deliberately introduced misconfigurations. The goal is to revert the attacker which are looking to exploit these misconfigurations. So an example of that is you create a honey token account and you make it vulnerable to Kerberoastable account. Now the attacker who is looking for such an opportunity during enumeration will find it. And so now you can detect an attack that's attempting that type of an exploit. Let's take a second example. By creating a honey token and granting it a controlled set of permissions or a privilege, you can actually lure the attacker that are looking to gain access to privileges. Ultimately, the goal of the attacker typically in an AD environment is to escalate privileges. So if you grant an appropriate set of permissions, now you can influence the attacker to go after that because they say, hey, this is an interesting account. It seems to have a right set of permissions. Let me go after that, right? So you can create an account, granted appropriate set of administrative privileges. Now you can detect attackers that can target such accounts and are attempting to escalate privileges. The third approach is the placement. Strategic placement is a very important dimension. So the goal is for the defense is to detect the attack early, right? Because if you let the attacker play out their hand too long, then it creates a problem because they will eventually create damage in the environment. So if you can place the honey tokens in strategic locations, so for example, in an Active Directory environment, there might be certain OUs where important accounts are set. And like, for example, a service accounts OU. And so you can place these deceptions at those OU level. Now you can detect attackers that are trying to go after them and exploit them, right? So from an overall considerations perspective, there are many dimensions to be considered for an effective honey token strategy. The type, the count, the placement, and more importantly, making them attractive to attackers. They need to be realistic, but also attractive. You cannot create too many, so each one of them has to be curated. And just putting them on Active Directory itself is also not sufficient because as we discussed earlier, the attacker can get to the endpoint and access credentials from the caches. So it is recommended to put the deceptions on the endpoint in the credential caches where the attacker is trying to go. So that way, at that point itself, you can give them the traps or the lures. And if they use them, then you can detect. Placement is very important because you need to put them at the right OUs, at the strategic locations on the endpoint. So even on the endpoint, it cannot be placed everywhere. You have to put them at the places where the attacker is likely to again target. So everything has to be, what is the attacker going to do here, right? And you set the traps up appropriately. And one other aspect which is very important is containment. So ultimately, if you want to make these honey tokens useful, then you have to grant certain permissions because if you make them represent nothing, then nobody will go after them. So if they need to be made granted permissions, then that has associated trade-off that because those permissions are real and they are real objects in Active Directory, if the attacker can take over the honey token, they can actually use that to create harm to the enterprise. So effectively, containment is very important to be able to say, let the attacker attempt, but if the attacker attempts, then we will cut off the attempt, right? So that's very important. They also need to be dynamic and refreshed. For example, attackers will check things like timestamps, logon count, password last set. So all of these need to be done correctly for an effective strategy. So let's see a quick video of this solution in action. So here is an example of how honey tokens can actually work in practice and how they can detect identity threats. So here is a case where the attacker gets to the endpoint. They're querying the local cache, looking for cache credentials. And so they bring down a modified version of get GPP password. and they're looking for a cache service account credential. Now on the endpoint, they find such a cache credential. This is a domain credential, and they attempt to use it. What the attacker doesn't realize is that this is a honey token, and which means that now at this point itself, you could detect the threat even much before the attacker actually went and targeted Active Directory and did some damage. So you could actually detect it very early in the offensive sequence and then cut off the response. And you're also diverting the attacker towards a deception and away from the real. So that way the attacker will never complete their mission. So from a summary perspective, defense in depth is the recommendation, which is to mitigate the identity attack surface. Effectively, identification and reduction of the attack surface as a prevention control is always important. Detection layers need to be combined so that you can maximize the coverage and eliminate the gaps. AD monitoring is a good thing. EDR is also a good thing. And then you can overlay them with honey tokens to detect and divert the threats away from the real identity. So that's how effectively you have prevent, detect, and respond. So you have all these layers, and then you can actually get comprehensive coverage. Thank you. If you have any questions, happy to take them on the Discord.
TriMark Vision is the next evolution in the identification of security issues across all your Active Directory environments. The TriMark Risk Score is based on real-world expertise of TriMark's industry-leading Active Directory and Microsoft Cloud security experts. Most importantly, TriMark Vision helps you to answer the questions facing your Active Directory security posture today, such as what risk do I have in my environment? What actionable steps can I take today, tomorrow, this week to best mitigate my risk of an attack on my Active Directory? What should I be most concerned about within my Active Directory forest where it concerns potential attack vectors? What is the current security posture of all my AD forests? TriMark Vision, visibility at the speed of operations.